Okay. Go away. Bye. Rachel, you're on.
All right. Okay, thank you. My name's Rachel Mason. Thank you and welcome to the Alaska Historical Society's first ever digital conference. We're experiencing a little bit of confusion here in the first moments. And unfortunately, our president, Will Schneider, has not been able to join us yet, but he'll be coming on later for a general welcome and also to give any housekeeping details that need to be done. But for now, if you're an attendee, you won't see your face in the digital conference. You'll only see the speakers and the other panelists. It'd be great if any of the panelists could mute themselves. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speakers, anthropologist Thomas F. Thornton and Tlingit elder Harvey Kitka. Tom recently joined me in a secret conspiracy by anthropologists to infiltrate the Alaska Historical Society.
Okay, I'll tell June.
He specializes in the study of indigenous and local knowledge and how humans interact with their environment. And he's worked extensively in Southeast Alaska, particularly in Sitka. We wanted to have this as a face-to-face conference about power and place centered in Sitka. And we're doing the best we can to recreate that in a digital format. I've worked with Tom several times over the years, starting in 2000 when he served as the principal investigator on an ethnographic overview and assessment for Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park. And a couple of years before that, Tom published an expansion of Goldschmidt and Haas's 1948 study of Tlingit lands in Southeast Alaska. And his expanded version is entitled Ha'ani, Our Land. Since then, he's conducted several more studies of the importance of place in Southeast Alaska and has found much of interest in Sitka. In one of his books, Being in Place Among the Tlingit, in 2008, Tom named Herman Kitka Sr. of Sitka as a primary mentor. And we're fortunate to have Kitka's son, Harvey, speaking with us today. Tom's 2012 study of Tlingit place names with the English name Our Grandparents' Names on the Land won an award from the Alaska Historical Society. His research for that book revealed that Sitka Sound had more toponymic hotspots than anywhere in Southeast Alaska. And he will be telling us today why the Sitka area has such a high concentration of important place names. Harvey Kitka, son of Herman and Martha Kitka and member of the Kagwantan clan, will offer insights on place and history in Sitka Sound, and both will provide more evidence, as if we needed it, that Sitka is indeed a powerful place. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Tom Thornton.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I really feel like an imposter at a historical association meeting, being an anthropologist, but you're right. I guess the book did win an award from the Historical Association, but I think that's more about their willingness and capacity to cross over into the ethnographic realm than maybe mine to cross over into history. But let's see how we do. I really like the focus of this session being on power and place, and that's certainly been something very, very near and dear to me. And most of what I learned about power and place around Sitka obviously came from the people I've worked with, including Herman Kitka and Harvey Kitka. So it's a great pleasure to be able to share some of what I learned from Herman with you and to share the stage with Harvey. So I think the way we're going to do this, and we're rehearsing on stage, as we say, is I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Did that work? And then go and do the play from start. So is everybody seeing that? I guess I can't see if you're seeing that, but hopefully somebody will chat if I'm not. And so we're calling this presentation Senses of Place and History in the Toponymic Hotspot of Sitka Sound. And Rachel stole a bit of my thunder, but if people have read our grandparents' names on the land, they'll know this. I wanted to first talk a little bit about history. And one of the things that interests me about history is there are new kinds of history developing all of the time. And one of the things that I've been interested in is so-called micro-histories, where you look at a very small unit of history, whether it's a community or a commodity, and you kind of trace the history of the world through that. I have a book coming out with Madonna Moss that includes actually some work that we did in Sitka and other communities on herring and people in the North Pacific. And it does have a historical component, but you might say it's an attempt to do a bit of a micro history. Look at some of the connections across the North Pacific among what we might call herring cultures. But these books, these kinds of historical books have proliferated. The other kinds of history which I've become interested in are social histories, which are kind of from below, not the dominant diplomatic histories or histories by so-called important people. The histories known as the longue durée or the long duration from the Annals School, where environment and demography and things like that are looked at, and not just important people and important historical events involving people. Then, of course, there's ethnohistory, which is typically thought of as history of non-Western people and utilizes what has been called by William Fenton upstreaming, where you're sort of looking at conditions today and trying to figure out what the origins of those conditions, as opposed to starting downstream at the beginning of a history, of historical time, and working your way forward, if that's really a direction in time. Then there's life histories, right? The history through individual lives. And then finally, environmental history, which really takes the relationship and coevolution of human society and the environment very seriously. And I'm not going to do any of these types of history justice, but I think there's a little bit of each of them, hopefully, in this presentation. And lots of good books. And I will say that I think environmental historians have a lot to offer, and was pleased to see, and then went out and read this book in the bottom right-hand corner called The Mortal Sea, Fishing the Atlantic in the Age of Sail by Jeffrey Bolsher, which won the Bancroft Prize. I think it was one of the first environmental histories to win the Bancroft Prize. All right, so the other thing about history that's exciting is to see it take a bit of an oceanic turn. I think really the only way to understand what's going on in Alaska history is to incorporate the ocean very, very directly. And when we do this, we do gain a different perspective. And a book that was influential to me was Brian Fagan, who I think has maybe not given the keynote here, but has done so at the little AAA, the Alaskan Anthropological Association. His book called Fish on Friday, which looks at, for example, the founding of America and Christopher Columbus, and sort of asks the question, what gave him the confidence to do this, and the backing from the King and Queen of Spain. And he relates the whole set of events to environmental conditions, and the fact that during that time, you were still in this little ice age in Europe. You'd experienced significant climate change. Christianity had spread across the continent and introduced a taboo against meat on Friday, which meant that you had to ramp up your fishing, and that in turn led to shortages in fishing, and fishermen going farther afield, in fact all the way to the northwest Atlantic to catch fish. And so he posits that Columbus in Ireland in 1490 is actually plotting his trip to North America on the backs of local knowledge of fishermen who had been kind of extending their reach, trying to supply fish on Friday to this Christianizing, demographically expanding, and climate change suffering, at least in agriculture, European scene. And so, you know, that's a radical rewriting of history, but it's one that comes from paying attention to the ocean. I don't know why I put Mark Kurlansky's book on cod, but that's a good example of a micro history. And then we could go closer to home, maybe in our American history, looking at George Washington's Mount Vernon, which I had a chance to visit a couple of years ago with one of my sons. And I don't know, I guess I had been there before as a kid, and all I remembered was the agricultural scene and the gentleman farmer. But Washington was also a pretty good fisherman and had a little industrial herring fishing operation on the Potomac there behind Mount Vernon. And it turns out that a lot of the herring that was dried and salted was used as provisions for slaves. So each slave got 20 salted herring a month, at least when supplies were limited. So that was a revelation to me. So what I'm getting at here is you could rewrite history by taking a more oceanic turn, and this view of Mount Vernon shows the Potomac in the background. But that was at least as important as the gardens and the agricultural plots. Okay, and then I don't know why I put Donald Trump down there, but because we're going to be talking about place names, I guess he went to Mount Vernon with the French president. Sorry. And asked why didn't George Washington name Mount Vernon after himself? Because that's what I would have done, I think, is the implication of that. But I'll leave that there. So another reason why we should be looking at oceans is because of their enormous productivity. And when we think about productive areas of the world in terms of oceans, we know that Alaska is one of the richest. And so taking an oceanic perspective on that productivity makes a lot of sense. And there's a few quotes to the right there about how oceans have been a kind of blind spot for historians and for scholars, quoting the poet Derek Walcott. Where are your monuments, your battles, your martyrs? Where is your tribal memory, sirs? In the great vault, the sea has locked them up. But there are ways of opening that vault, as we'll see. And then on the lower side, William Cronin commenting on how what happens in the salt water is relegated to the margins of history. William Cronin being one of these environmental historians who helped rewrite the book on how we understand the relationship between Native Americans and their lands in New England. And so if we look at the North Pacific, just as an environment, we look at its productivity, which means looking at little critters like plankton, we see that that productivity corresponds obviously with a certain level of biocultural diversity that exists on the Northwest coast all the way up into the Bering Sea, but especially on what we call properly the Northwest coast from the Gulf of Alaska on down. And that, of course, has led to this whole phenomenon in archaeology and ethnology of the complex hunter-gatherer. So here, quoting my old department chair at Portland State, Ken Ames, what are complex hunter-gatherers? And I add the term cultivators, and you'll see why. Or cultures and societies that have cultural, social, and economic traits that anthropologists and other scholars long assumed required agriculture for them to develop. And then these are some of the characteristics: large, dense populations, semi-sedentary or permanent settlements, stratified or multi-level social structure, high levels of domestic production, usually through extended households, lineages, house groups, that sort of thing, extensive trade and exchange, territoriality, conflict, high technological development, and well-developed resource management, and there it is, that term cultivation techniques. And so the fact that you have so-called hunter-gatherers who are cultivators has actually created this kind of paradoxical labeling where we get to the Northwest coast and we really have to throw out that term hunter-gatherer as a legitimate term to describe the mode of subsistence here, because there's a lot of things that resemble cultivation. so what kind of environment enabled that? Obviously, the coastal zone productivity in terms of fisheries, marine mammals, marine invertebrates, plants, seabirds, and of course the terrestrial environment as well. And not to leave out the temperate rainforest, of course, that's very, very important. But of course, that's just a sliver. If you look at the map on the right, which is an old map that I like that was done by InfraRain, which later became EcoTrust. And what they were trying to show there is the health of the mature rainforests in the Pacific coastal rainforest ecumen. And what you see is the red zones, basically, which are southern, are in worse shape than the green zones, which include the Tongass. Yeah, I'm going to keep going then because we started a little late. So that this phenomenon of complex hunter-gatherers looks like, yeah, coastal zone of productivity. I guess I skipped a slide. So here you see how the biodiversity is represented, excuse me, the cultural diversity is represented by language groups. And I guess on the map here to the right, you see the fact that the groups are actually smaller in terms of the area that they claim the further south you go. And then some of the larger areas you find as you go north, which is a general pattern in the Northwest coast, but also in other culture areas as you move away from the equator. Okay, for some reason, I'm not always going in the right direction. All right, so when we talk about cultivation, the way I like to think about it amongst a lot of indigenous peoples, including those of the Northwest Coast culture area, but also other areas as well, is in terms of socio-ecological systems where the social systems are not only benefiting from the goods and services of the ecological systems, which is kind of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment model, if you're familiar with that, but are actually contributing to it. So it's not just that people enjoy ecosystem services provided by nature, including clean air, high water quality, various species that they depend on, plants and animals and so on, but they are actually providing services to those ecosystems, things like protecting services, which would be like habitat protection, weeding and culling, ritual regulation, cultural prohibitions on certain activities at certain times of year, that sort of thing. Also enhancing services, things like cultivating herring, which we'll talk about, or salmon, but also processes like domestication, trait selection, translocation, fertilization, and then restoring services, doing things to improve soil, to improve habitat, nutrients, revitalization of traditional practices, and also supporting services. So I think this is a nicer model than the one, if you've seen the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where it's all a one-way arrow between nature providing goods and services to human well-being. In this model, which I think could characterize a lot of indigenous societies around the world, but certainly those in Alaska, it's more of a reciprocal model where people value ecosystem services, but they're also see themselves as providing services to ecosystems, maybe not in this same technical way that's described here, but through some means of cultivation. Okay, then two other ideas I want to introduce and then kind of apply them in the Sitka historical setting are one, the concept of a cultural keystone species. So, when you look at a society as an anthropologist or as a historian, you always have to be selective, right? You can't understand everything at the same time equally. And of course, things influence events and the contours of history differently over time. So one of the useful things that you can do, or at least it's suggested in the realm of cultural resource management, is focus on what are called keystone species. So these species may not be the most plentiful, but they are critical to people and to cultures in terms of how they make a living. So that's the concept of the cultural keystone species over there, first promulgated by Anne Garibaldi and Nancy Turner. So these are species that are taken in high intensity. They feature cultivation, multiplicity of use, rich cultural linguistic associations, persistence of use in time and in memory, irreplaceable role in the socio-ecological system, and a high exchange value. And then a kind of concept that's dovetailed on that, also featuring some of the same authors, or at least Anne Garibaldi and Nancy Turner, is this concept of cultural keystone places. And so these are sites or locations with high cultural salience for one or more groups of people, and which play or has played in the past an exceptional role in people's cultural identity as reflected in their day-to-day living, food production, and other resource-based activities, landed research management, language, stories, history, and social and ceremonial practices. And so some of the key characteristics are laid out there. So certainly one way to do history when you don't have all of the archives to tell you about a particular environmental and social system or a socio-ecological system is you might concentrate on cultural keystone places and cultural keystone species. So that's kind of the premise. But in the way it's been written up, history doesn't necessarily feature. So here's a kind of a schematic of what cultural keystone place analysis would look like. It would have some socioeconomic analysis, some cultural analysis, some environmental analysis, and then at the center of that, at the nexus, you would find cultural keystone places. So I'm just reflecting here that history has to be a part of all of that: socioeconomic history, cultural history, and environmental history. Okay, and so in doing work on place names in Sitka, I did become interested in how high the concentration was of the density of place names around Sitka. And just to give you an idea of how this project developed, this was a project I started really with my dissertation work, and quickly learned, as a wise DPhil or PhD student does, that it was too much to handle. And so I ended up writing a different dissertation on that became being in place among the Tlingit, that relied a lot actually on knowledge that I gained from people in Sitka and Angoon, and especially Herman Kitka Sr. But I subsequently followed up and tried to do a fairly comprehensive place name atlas. Hasanisaku was our grandparents' names on the land, and that was, excuse me, that was this effort to kind of map them all out, and that was a big job, and it's necessarily incomplete because we couldn't interview everybody. We're coming at a time when a lot of people are no longer speaking the language or necessarily inhabiting the places that would have been named. But that effort produced still about 3,500 names. And you know, the first thing you see is that they're not evenly distributed. So there are so-called hotspots, there are densities. And I guess one of the questions I was interested in is, what is the relationship between these place name hotspots in relation to other biotic and abiotic factors? And so with a student at Oxford named Sarah Jones, we looked at this as part of an MSc project she did for a master's degree, and found certain correlations. So place name hotspots obviously correlate with high densities of Tlingit place names, but also with anadromous waters, basically all the capitalized categories on the left of the slide there. Marine mammal concentrations in birds, summering and wintering areas, slope, so basically it's a negative correlation where you have really steep slopes, with mean temperature, and with max NDVI, which is a vegetative index. And so that was interesting information, but it raised some interesting points at the regional level. But I was also interested at what do these places mean at the local level? You know, why do we have them? And of course, part of the answer goes back to cultural keystone species, but part of it also goes back to where people settled and why. And so all that I've just told you about the so-called complex hunter-gatherers and cultivators throughout the Northwest Coast region. Writ small is true at various regions within the Northwest Coast. And so here, this map is representing what is a fairly linear relationship, or at least logarithm relationship between place name hotspots and populations. And so you'll see, for example, where it's darker and brown and you see a bigger dot, that means that the dot represents population from a historical census, which is not perfect. And then the place names represents the density of names in that area as a kind of heat map. And so there's a pretty good correlation there, but you do see big holes, right? And those gaps raise questions. And so one of them would be Wrangell. So the community of Wrangell is not necessarily well represented in place names, but we see that there's a pretty big dot there. And just the opposite in Ketchikan, we find in Saxman, it's a small dot, but obviously lots of heat around Boca de Quadra and that whole area. So, you know, that shows some of the limitations of the data, because we know there should be lots of place names around Wrangell, but because of the early events that occurred there, the Cassiar Gold Rush and the Hudson Bay Company and so forth, that a lot of those connections were lost through disease and what we might call acculturation, displacement, that sort of thing. And we know we're very fortunate because of earlier studies that were done by people like Thomas Waterman in southern Southeast, that there was a very, very high density of names, particularly in that mainland area, but I suspect also around Klawock. And then, you know, the general consensus is that Tlinkits moved from south to north, and so we might expect that there would be fewer names on the kind of northern frontier. But if you put Sitka in that northern frontier of Southeast Alaska, it does have the highest density of place names throughout its region, and all the more surprising because it's an island community, and often island communities have lower populations and not such high densities because they're not on a major 5 salmon species river like the Fraser River or the Taku or Alsek or whatever. So that has a lot to do with the abiotic and biotic factors that are within Sitka Sound itself, which is an extraordinary body of water, incredibly diverse with a lot of structure and a lot of biodiversity. So then if you look at forage fish, which included both, in this sample, herring and hooligan, you'll see, again, there's an interesting correlation, but it's not perfect. But again, Sitka scores very highly because of the herring spawning areas. There's not much hooligan around Sitka, but there is up in other places like up in towards Yakutat, we find hooligan runs, and down towards Ketchikan. But there is a positive correlation there. Some interesting exceptions that aren't captured because they don't involve spawning would in this case be Angoon. So Angoon there doesn't show any pink for forage fish spawning streams, but we know that there were large, from our historical documents and from oral history, there were large massings of herring in the fall time around Angoon in Favorite Bay, and that was a very important part of people's subsistence, not only directly, but also through what else the herring brought with them, the things that eat herring. And that's what we're looking at over here on the left side, is just how foundational, as well as keystone, foundational meaning it's the really foundational to the whole food web, herring is. So this is the percentage of the diet consuming herring. And so you see it's as high as 71% for lingcod, 53% for Pacific halibut, 82%, or is that 62? I can't read. 62% for king salmon, 58 for coho. So very, very important. Okay, moving on. So this is literally the map in the book, So this is the Sitka map. And we documented about 500 names. And I want to give credit to to the people involved in this, because the process for gathering these names involved community researchers, as well as myself and Harold Martin, who was kind of directing the project through Tlingit and Haida, as well as elders. And in Sitka, it was very interesting because we had two women who were our researchers, Vida Davis and Ethel Makinen, who's pictured at the bottom left-hand side there. And they had actually done a previous project for the Sitka Native Education Program involving Ethel's father, Charlie Joseph Sr., who's all the way on the right here. I don't think if my cursor goes over there, I don't know if you can see it, but involved him in a place name documentation project, I think in the 70s it started. And they had documented about 400 some names. And Herman Kitka Sr., who's here on the left underneath the book cover, was Charlie's nephew, so both Kagwantan. So they shared a lot of knowledge base, and so Herman was able to confirm those names that Charlie had given, but also to add others from his own experience. And so that documentation proved to be about the best in terms of numbers of names that we came up with in any of the new communities we surveyed, that is communities that hadn't been surveyed before by people like De Laguna, Frederica De Laguna, or Thomas Waterman, who I mentioned. And the highest concentration was right here in Sitka Sound. So that's what we're looking at, the area in front of town and up through Middle Island and down towards Silver Bay. And that area, of course, is also very controversial because of what's happened with the herring fisheries there. Basically a decline in the subsistence fishery and an increase in the commercial sacro fishery. But prior to that, you can see from the names that a significant number, but not a lot, if you're talking about 500, refer directly to herring. And one of the most important is this rock here called Herring Rock, which is right almost at the epicenter of Sitka Sound, and really was the place that herring used to begin their spawning close to shore. And it's a sacred place to the Kiksati clan, and there's a blanket and so forth that go along with it. But there are other names as well. Islands named for herring. This Middle Island, which carries a name that references jumping fish and refers to that amazing story, the Salmon Boy story, where he documents how the salmon coming in while the herring are going out after spawning and the salmon are coming in, they insult each other and jump around as they pass a middle island. And then others that actually refer to spawning places, or even to the milt that spreads over the surface of the water, the white milt, when they're spawning. Okay, and so one of the people who directed me towards issues with herring as kind of a problem, if you will, an ethno-historical problem, was Herman Kitka Sr. And he was very clear that before the commercial sacro fishery, I'm actually quoting him here, the Sitka Tlingit engaged in herring fishing from small boats. The herring were caught, either raked or netted, and were used to make herring oil. Herring eggs were taken and dried on trees. There's some photos of that activity. The trees were even shaped so that they could hold and dry herring eggs. And then people also dried them on their porches and preserved them. And he said all the islands where they used to do this have names, and they were used together with the families around Sitka. And he said that herring egg gathering used to go for 3 or 4 weeks of spawning, for last week of March and first 2 weeks of April commonly. And now that 3 or 4 week period is down to just a couple of days, if that. And so he was very concerned about this and really wanted to document this process and see if it could be reversed, because for him and for other people who spoke about it, herring were really the foundation as well as the keystone to the whole Sitka Sound history and the ecosystem. I should reference these other photos here, but this one here is quite interesting because this is an article written in 1955 by Carl Kenyon, who was a biologist that Herman worked with. And he wrote an article for Natural History calling Herman the last of the Tlingit sealers. And the article was about hunting fur seal. But one of the things that they had noticed is that the fur seal population was declining, and they came to Sitka to look at it because Sitka was a very important stopover. Sitka Sound and bays around it were a very important stopover for fur seal heading up to the Pribilof Islands. And the hypothesis that they latched onto and that Herman thought made the most sense was that the juvenile, the younger fur seals were not capable of getting enough herring with the declines in herring in order to survive the long migration from the south, way down south, South Pacific, all the way up to the Pribilof Islands. But anyway, that was an interesting study, but already it shows his concern for herring even as a much younger man back in the 50s. Okay, and then of course we've seen what's happened with herring in that since it's been open to commercial fishing, and both in the reduction era, which was from about literally 1880s till 1966, but it really started around World War I, the ramping up of the industry. And then when it died in 66, you started again in the 70s with the sacro fishing, which was for a Japanese market. And again, there's this North Pacific connection because the Japanese had a lot of money in the 80s and 90s. Their economy was on the rise, but they had not much herring because they had overfished it. And so they brought their appetites over here and the market was there. But since that opened up, you essentially have had closures of all the major areas around Sitka, except for Sitka Sound for commercial sacro fishing Klawak area for spawn on kelp. And of course, that's competing in Sitka Sound very directly with the subsistence fishery, which I'm going to let Harvey describe. And there he is there on the right-hand side, getting some western hemlock branches for putting out as substrate for herring to lay their eggs on. And both Harvey and I had an opportunity to work with something called the Ocean Modeling Forum and a group called the Herring Group that was part of that was trying to look at the importance of herring to human well-being. And this is a graphic from that group on the lower right side over here. And all the components that need to go right in order for us to conserve, if you want to use the word manage, herring for human well-being. And that was a very interesting group because it involved people from Canada, from Alaska, from California, biologists, traditional knowledge experts, from social scientists, people from industry as well. So, but the other thing I wanted to point out about this slide is the way it shows a different historical perspective. So as I said in the slide, when Herman was concerned, his frame was going back to, his youth at least, but also to the oral history he'd heard about Sitka. And he was born in 1914. Martin Perez, who's commenting here on the upper right, from Ketchikan, was about the same age. And he said the herring population now is just a drop compared to what it used to be. We used to go through schools and schools of herring in my young days, all the way from Alaska down to Washington and Oregon. Schools and schools of herring. Now we don't see that anymore. So again, his perspective is much prior to statehood, whereas one of the commercial fishermen here in the lower right is saying the amount of spawn in the area is much stronger than 40 years ago. And this is kind of a classic problem in fisheries management that's called shifting baselines. And so if you came to Alaska after statehood and you've been fishing and you're relying on those statistics produced by the Department of Fish and Game, you can miss the fact that the big shift in herring occurred during the reduction era, which was more or less closing by the time of statehood. And the baseline of what you would consider plentiful had already shifted. And then what follows is a kind of historical amnesia, is what Callum Roberts calls it, about just how abundant herring used to be. All right, so I'm gonna turn this over to Harvey, I'm going to move on to this next slide and just introduce the map. But this was a map that we produced for a publication on the contested landscape of Sitka Sound, focusing on basically the perspective of the indigenous group, the Sitka tribe, especially in terms of how that should be managed and what the values in that landscape were versus the state fish and game group. And he can kind of update you on what's happened and also maybe explain this, because it's actually quite an intricate drawing of how herring move in and out of Sitka Sound and why people use the areas they do. So with that, can I turn it over to you, Harvey? Oh, I think you might be muted. Or can you unmute?
Okay,
Yeah, there you
Oh,
go.
there we go.
thank you, Tom. I'd like to go back a little bit on some of the things that you talked about first. Probably because of the place names and things that happened. As you know, that our Kitka people were a food-based society. As a result, that a lot of the place names that were given place names were because families wanted to pass on to their children where to gather food, certain types of food, and when to go get it. There was always a time when you gathered things in certain areas over time. It seemed like families lived in a lot of different places in Southeast Alaska. So a lot of these place names came from what is basically different communities now. There were summer places that the people lived in the summertime to gather their food. There were places where they lived in the wintertime as they came together, and places that didn't freeze during the wintertime and the ocean stayed open and allowed them to go and gather food in the wintertime. So there's a lot of places that have names, and some of them have overlapping names. So this was one of the reasons I wanted to go back to some of the place names. And some of the place names are, some of our people are a little concerned that it got put on a map to where people could see where some of the things are being gathered. Some of our elders, like even my father, used a lot of these place names and things because of the stories that were gathered over time. He knew how the fish traveled. He knew where they went and when they came by there in some places. One of the reasons he was such a known fisherman in Sitka Sound, and one of the people that could catch fish no matter where they were at, because they already knew how the fish traveled because of the stories that were told over and over again. I'm sure Tom talked to my father about some of these place names where names are given, and even how the dog salmon traveled for one instance. But I can go back and talk about this for a long time, but I would probably want to go talk about the herring and the problems that we've had since my dad kind of handed this off to me after 1998, after our meeting with the board of fish over the herring. In 1998, we had a board of fish meeting here in Sitka Sound And basically our elders went and talked about the herring fishing, which we were starting to get very concerned about. In that time, where there were so many people from Sitka that came to talk, they put a 3-minute time limit on us to say our speech, our talk on the herring. Our elders, who were raised in the old way, by the time they got through introducing themselves, their 3 minutes were almost up. And when their 3 minutes came, the board of fish hit the button and said, "That's enough now." So when it got to my turn to talk, I thanked them for being so polite to our elders. I really felt bad that they didn't really listen to all the things that were said about the herring. As a result, in all our battles with the Board of Fish, in the early days, we tried to convince the managers, the herring managers, that we needed to protect the herring, to try to get them to change things. Come to find out, we were beating our head against the wrong one. So we went back to the Board of Fish and start making our own proposals to the Board of Fish and trying to get things changed. We started to make some headway, and then the commercial industry, which had better lobbyists, as you would say. They had guys that were paid to go talk to these people. As they talked to the board, we lost ground again. Then we started learning how to lobby and do this and that to be able to grab them off on the side and talk to them. Being as the Board of Fish, most of them have never been around a fishery. So it's really hard to explain to them how important this herring are. We've tried many times to tell them that from the time they're a little egg till when they disintegrate, they're food for something. They're food for other things that feed us in the ocean. As their body disintegrates after they spawn, because a certain percentage will die and fall to the bottom right wherever they spawn. And as they become things, and they became food for other things that create plankton, and the plankton is food for, it's a constant cycle that happens with them, and we watched it. Our people gathered these eggs, and we gathered them basically within a certain portion of the tide line. That portion being the part that usually washes loose and ends up on the beach. This is a percentage that usually will not make it and die. So that we gathered these fish, but we didn't take the spawners that we're going to keep on coming back and spawning. One of the things I've been trying to convince the Board of Fish and the managers that they're taking a percentage of the herring. Then which was fine for a while, and it seemed to be working, but then all of a sudden they realized that Japan wanted the bigger herring, the older herring. So they start targeting the older herring. And as they started finding out that the the older herring spawn first. Then they start opening areas where the herrings were spawning. So they were targeting the older herring, not realizing they were taking 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe even 9-year-old herring out of the spawning mass. You know, when you target the bigger percentage of the older herring, eventually you're going to run out of older herring. And pretty soon you're going to end up with just young herring. And basically that's what happened in Sitka Sound. 2 years ago, they couldn't find enough older herring for them to fish. So after a while, they gave up trying. Then last year, it was still basically the same way. The claps, if they allowed them to fish again, will happen pretty sudden, because if you don't have spawning herring, then the population's going to decrease rapidly, because there won't be no new ones to replace them. Pretty hard to make them understand this point of view. As long as they got money market, they're going to be targeting these herring the way they are. It's really sad that local knowledge and things that we've talked about and seen over the years is not being acknowledged at a point. For a while, we thought we were able to make some progress on this, but it seems like we're losing that battle again. So, as you look at the map on the slide that is showing now, there's an area in the middle of Sitka Sound where one of the things that our people tried was to close off an area where the herring normally came back to spawn. You can see other areas of how the herring came into Sitka Sound and which way they went. Well, as time went on and as the fishery went on, they found that they could target these fish as they were coming in like that and divert them from the closed off area, to the point where for about 3 years, we didn't have any herring spawn within that closed area, which was an area that herring spawned for thousands of years. One corner of that in Sitka Sound was a place called the Herring Rock. And that was given that name because that was one of the places that they came back for thousands of years. Some of the stories that pertain to that herring rock and why it was named that was, the story belongs to the Kiksati, but basically it had to do with the herring spawning and coming back to that area. So one of those areas that they've come back for thousands of years, and it's just amazing that they could stop the herring from even making it there anymore. Some of the other places along like Middle Island and Cassiana Island, up in those areas, they were places where the first plankton for the food for the young ones to start happened. For whatever reason, whether it's a thermal thing underwater or what, the plankton exploded in the area just about the same time as the herring were spawning. So this was food for the young ones when they hatched out. Another portion of what strange thing has happened is they're now releasing the chum and the dog salmon within these areas, and at the early ages of these herring and the plankton growth, they all happen at the same time. The plankton is being eaten up almost sometimes faster than the herring could survive. So the food is being compromised at an early age. One of the things that we told Fish and Game on a telltale sign and a lot of things is that the more they target the herring, we notice that halibut from one point has started to shrink. The 30-year-old halibut were starting to get smaller. So this was quite a long time ago that we started talking about them, about something happening in the ocean that was causing this problem. And the more they targeted the herring, we started to see that the king salmon were starting to shrink. And when they fished out the areas in Sitka Sound where we used to have local stocks that lived within our bays, the king salmon used to come in, and we used to catch some big king salmon May and June, July. He used to come right into the Sound. He was coming right into the harbors. Some of our Sitka salmon derbies where we had king salmon derbies, we had 70-pound king salmon that used to show up in our derby. And this was in a very small area where they allowed the derby fishing to happen. When the food for the salmon start to disappear, we start losing some of the big fish. They didn't come in anymore. Along with that, the study that my dad did with the fur seal, we used to have a lot of herring that used to come within Sitka Sound and down along the coast into the different bays. But we had fur seal that used to come right into Silver Bay because of the herring that were there. We don't see fur seal in Sitka Sound or even along the west coast anymore of our island, being as the population of herring has dropped to a point where it's not really a stopping point for the fur seal anymore. So we have a lot of concerns. We got a lot of things to work on. This isn't going to be something we're not going to give up until we get something done. So I'm not too sure how much more I can say about this, but I was involved with trying to protect the herring in Sitka Sound since about 1998. I was already middle-aged adult at the time, and now I'm starting to get to where I'm starting to slow down a bit, but I still try to get my point across to some of my younger people and try to get them involved. This last year or two, that trying to find places where we could get our herring was really tough. The herring were spawning in places where they hadn't spawned before. One of the reasons being is that our elders told us that the older herring were the ones that showed the younger ones where to spawn and where the food was going to come from. As they fished out the older herring, they had nobody to show them where to spawn anymore. It's really sad. I know this. The talk about older herring is basically something our elders talked to us about. They were basically like teachers for the younger herring of where to spawn and where the best places were. So one of the reasons we seen the herring when they came into the sound, they traveled back and forth quite rapidly, but they also seem to be able to find these places where they spawned. The plankton used to start in some places and then just blossom all the way down the coast and all the way north, because the herring would start spawning probably in as far south as San Francisco Bay, and then they'd work their way up the coast as time and water temperature changed and the planktons in different places. And spawn all the way, it just travel up and the whole outside coast would turn white. And people tell us when they were out there in the ocean, you could see herring for a long ways. One of the places where Tom talked about the jumping herring was probably on the outside of Middle Island and the outside of the islands there where the herring came ashore from the ocean and come out of the deep. One of the reasons they jump is to get the air bubbles out of their system, because they're changing from the deep where they come out from almost 100 fathoms down and come up into the shallows, and they have to adapt to swimming in the shallows again. So the bubbles in their bodies are expanding, and they do a lot of jumping to release these air bubbles. Some of these things I don't know if they even listen to us about, knowing how our people observe these herring. Every phase of the life of different things was observed over time. I know when I was growing up, one of my uncles told me something, and he asked me about it, and when I didn't know the answer, he kind of got peeved with me. He said, "You got to learn to observe, see things around you." And so it's one of the things that we had to learn. It's something that was passed on to us so that we could observe and learn what is happening around in the ocean. Because this was the place where we lived, and this was our food. One of the big names of why some of the place names are so popular and there are so many in Sitka Sound and around the area. When the ice was retreating, our people landed on the outside of Cruzoff Island. This was in this area was the first place that they landed, because there was only big trees in that area, because prevailing winds and the volcanoes, the volcanic ash was all shifting towards Sitka Sound. Baranoff Island at that time was basically just shrubbery. There was no trees on Baranoff Island. So this was a long time ago. You go back and look at some of the big trees that are growing there now and try to visualize what the island looked like. So a lot of the places that got place names start happening after the ice start retreating, and we were able to get names in place on them. Some of the place names are actually carryover from some of the old stories that were told, because we lived here before the ice, and some of the names go back even before that. I know when Dad was talking about it, he said when the ice age started, it didn't really get cold. It just started snowing and never stopped. So when the people start retreating, they had, in some places they walked across the ice to get to the outer coast. So now they're finding some of our tools that are below the volcanic ash. So this was a long time ago. I don't know. I think I'll ask Tom to if he needs it to say anymore.
Tom, while you get yourself unmuted, this is Karen, and there's a question for you, Harvey, from Sue Sheriff. She wrote in the question and answer. So I'll just read it to you right now, if that's okay with you, Tom, or do you want to finish first?
No, that's fine.
Okay, so Harvey, Sue asks, are any of the place names for non-gathering places widely used today? Or are all the place names in the Sitka area more commonly used by their English names?
They're used by the English names now because there's an awful lot of our people that lost the language and cannot speak this language anymore. But we tell our kids in the English language where these places are, because Middle Island is, and we knew parts of Middle Island where the herring like to spawn in certain spots within the island. So we can explain to them where it is in our English language. There are places that we gather stuff, and when we go get it, it's not only for herring eggs, but for halibut and for sockeye and for the different types of salmon, different times of the year, you know. But we basically don't use the Tlingit names anymore, but we still explain to the kids where it's at. I got a lot of nephews that I helped along the way and tried to explain to them how to gather and where to gather and what to use. And some of them are doing pretty well at it. And one of the things I feel like I fell down a little bit on is getting them to learn how to share with their relatives, their older relatives and things. Some of these things we're losing, and I hope we can eventually get them back. I'm sorry, I got kind of sidetracked a bit, but did I answer your question okay?
I might add that I think in some communities, it is a younger community that's learning the language, and they seem to want to bring place names back. So some of them have been nominated for inclusion, you know, on the gazetteer, the official gazetteers of place names from USGS, but also they're just being added to new schools, new streets, and other places. And I've seen this a little bit in Sitka too, haven't you, Harvey? Where if a new place is built, they're considering giving it a Tlingit name.
Oh yes, we've had a talk with the city about adding our Tlingit names to it. We actually pretty much asked them to give it the Indian name first, and then the names that were given to them later on. A large part of it because we felt that the Russian influence was here, but it wasn't here that long. Our Tlingit people have been here for thousands of years, and some of these names need to be in place. And these were place names that belonged to our people. We got a place out by the ferry terminal where we laughed, and they said this river had no name. They called it a no-name stream. But actually, my father, when he first looked at it and laughed, he said, it always had a name. Its name was Always in the Shade Stream. No matter what time of the day it was always in the shade. So there's a lot of places people could know where we talked about when we talked about some of these names. And so we're glad that some of our people are asking and pushing to get names put back on within our town that have names. We got a middle school that was called I think it was Vestovia School for a while. Now they call it Kikushihin, which is a little stream there that the stream used to flow by that school. It basically a killer whale stream. Basically, it was given that name back when the first Sitka was basically formed. It's not an old name, it's a fairly new name. When the Russians basically asked the Kagwantan and gave them a piece of the land because of what the Russians had done to our people. The Kagwantan put a staff out there, a dolphin, and put it out in front of that stream. And this basically said that this land belonged to the Kagwantan. That story got lost somewhere along the way, but it basically was why that stream was named Kikushihin. So there's names that are starting to show here and there about things like that happened, and we're able to get some things tied into a lot of places. And eventually, I think, like Tom said, we'll get back to it. I know I've been pushing very hard to get our Native education to start getting a deep immersion class for not only the young people, but for their families, so that their families, if they go into a deep immersion camp type thing, where they'd only speak our language. I know the push on some of this is that our people haven't lost the language, but a large part of them want to learn it again. So I know I've been asking for this, and I think we're working on it, but it's going to take some time.
I think we can open it up now to questions from the general public or general audience. And I'd like to ask people to raise their hands, and then I'll tell Karen to unmute you. And while you're starting to do that, I have a question for both of you. And that is, I noticed that Tlingit place names aren't usually human names. They're not named after people. Unlike the Trump example that Tom gave of naming things after yourself, I wonder if you could comment on that, and why is that people's names aren't usually in the Tlingit place names?
You want me to answer that, Tom?
Yeah, I think so, because you could speak specifically about the Kitka brand, right? Like the Trump brand, and what you're doing about that. No, go ahead.
Well, I know this is not a perspective that people really understand. As growing up, my uncles who tutored me along the way, not so much as they used to, but as they did, one of the things that really stuck to my mind, and which my uncles really made me understand, was that you don't talk about yourself. You talk about other people. You can talk about relatives and things, but you could never talk about yourself. He said, basically, you don't brag. You don't talk this way. So if we talk about it, we talk about other people that and almost an abstract. Basically, it was like a Koho or a Kiksati person. And we're given names that basically were not the person, but basically the clans. And some of the names that were used were only used by these certain types of clans, and that belonged to them. And it was given, these things were given to them. It was added as part of the stories. The outside of Baranoff Island was basically what Shishkakwan meant was the outer coast people. So some of these things were given that, but very few places were given anything with personal names attached to it. I don't know if I can say it any better than that, Tom.
Yeah.
Maybe you can expound on that.
Oh, that's good. I mean, I think the other reason why you have it in maybe the European tradition is because it is more individualistic, and names aren't necessarily passed on the same way. So, you know, your clan names get passed on. So your individual immortality, if you will, is recognized in other ways. So you don't necessarily have to put it on the land. But also, I think there was just a deference to descriptiveness and to the land itself. So there's a great line in Eliza Skidmore's Guide to Alaska, which talks about Glacier Bay names and how, you know, it's a shame that we lost the native names, and how we have this way of basically putting these names of insignificant historical figures who were deemed important to flatter at the time, you know, like Dundas Bay or something. And Dundas was a chancellor of the exchequer that maybe helped support one of the expeditions, but otherwise it's not anybody who ever spent any time, you know, in Dundas Bay. So of course that's now seen as a kind of colonial tactic to put a name on something as a claim and on behalf of somebody important. Oh. So I know in Glacier Bay they actually put a moratorium on that kind of biographical naming, you know, for just that reason, and because there are these other names, these indigenous names, most of them coming from Huna, Tlingit community, that are wonderfully descriptive and encapsulate histories of use and propriety over the lands.
Harvey, I muted you while your phone was ringing, so you will need to unmute your microphone. And then Patu Glenn had written a question or a comment, so I unmuted you, allowed you to unmute, Patuk, if you would like to say it yourself, if you have a microphone.
Thank you, Karen. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, this is Patu Glenn. I'm from Utqervik, or Barrow, Alaska. And I just want to thank both of you for such a, an informative and interesting presentation. I previously worked for the North Slope Borough at the Inupiat Heritage Center. And so I understand the value of traditional place names, because there's so much information that can be carried by our names that you're not going to find necessarily on a USGS map, or you're not going to find that with these names that were given to our communities by explorers or by state and federal officials. And here's an example. There's a place in our region that it's something like Sikutaganailak or something like that, which roughly translates to the place that you don't sleep at. And so, many people that are camping in the area, they know they don't stay at that place because it's not a good place to sleep at. And maybe it was either because it's unsafe because of weather or spirits or what have you. But, documenting those places is just so important, and carrying on those names to our youth is so important. And we have a person specifically within the North Slope government that travels to the villages, works with the elders on documenting these place names. And so the North Slope Borough has this huge database of these different place names. And it's pretty cool because with modern technology, you can, actually drop a pin on a map and then have all that information saved. Now, I'm wondering in Southeast if there are any organizations that are currently doing that, or if, I'm hoping that there's an organization that does that. Harvey, are you aware of any organizations that document traditional place names for the region?
I believe Tom is working for Sea Alaska on that. You want to answer that, Tom?
Oh yeah. Well, the basically what went into the atlas ended up with the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that is regional, and they've built an exhibit out of it, which some of it I think has now been put online, but it's basically an exhibit in their cultural center where you can basically have a big touch screen TV. It's flat, like table, and you can move in, touch names and hear the pronunciation if it was recorded. Back when I did a lot of the recording, but also some of the community researchers back on cassette tape in the 90s. But now it's been digitized, and you can hear that and sometimes see pictures or narratives that go with the places. And so not all of it's public because the reasons Harvey said, some people want to be protective of some things, but other things are public. And so I think that's a very good resource for continuing to add to it, but also to put voice behind the names and the history and cultural associations of those places, which are still known by lots of people. So that's one source. And then I think tribes are working with their own material. What we did is we transferred everything we did at the community level back to the tribes. And some of them have made their own maps and exhibits. I know they did one in Haines as well. It sits in the library, which has been very popular, and in other places as well. But I think in this case of the herring illustrates where when you find a hotspot and you understand some of the cultural keystone aspects of it, whether it's landscape or species, you can do a better job through that understanding of actually managing the place, not necessarily preserving it, but conserving it in a way that honors and values that history. And I think in that respect, place names have been important in this battle over the herring, if you will. And I think it's best exemplified by that one place that we alluded to. We didn't talk about it in detail, but Yao Tei, which is Herring Rock, which is, you know, on that last map. And, you know, that place was literally blown up, dynamited in the early 70s to make room for the pier, essentially, which became the Sheffield Hotel, named after a former governor. And the tribe actually got remnants of that rock, and they made a commemorative sign about Herring Rock, and they still perform ceremonies there. And that one place, even though it was a little rock, it was kind of this epicenter for productivity and for herring spawning in Sitka Sound. And the way it was spoken about by the Kiksati elder who we interviewed in the herring synthesis project, he said that place literally draws herring in. That's how powerful that place is. But how was it treated? Maybe we can say out of ignorance, maybe it's wanton ignorance. It was dynamited and up. So I think even though it's maybe too late to reinstall it, we can still learn the lessons of Herring Rock through the place names and the stories behind it.
Tom?
Yeah.
One of the Kiksati elders saved a piece of that rock, and they put it by our community house. So every year at just before the herring spawn, we usually have a little ceremony by it. Kiksati will put on a little ceremony for that herring rock, and we talk about it and kind of go through a ceremony of blessing the rock again. So out of our respect for herring. So a piece of it was saved, but it's close to where it was, but it's up on dry land now.
I just there's a message to Patuk from Jack Omiluk that the BIA ANGSA program has place name materials identified in both ANGSA and ANILCA. That message got sent to all of the panelists, but the attendees didn't see that. So I just wanted to read that out loud. And Tom, the Dry Bay Project Jukebox has place names that are read out loud so you can hear their Tlingit pronunciation. Is that included in the material you were talking about?
Yeah, and I mean, that project was done by the Park Service, but some of it was done jointly with the project I spoke about earlier for documenting place names. But yeah, that's a good point. That Project Jukebox has a recording that's accessible, and there are also separate recordings that were made from the other work that was done in Yakutat, and even some from De Laguna's work there in the 40s and 50s. So that's in some ways very well documented area, but Dry Bay is especially important. And in fact, the Park Service has been supporting further work on kind of better representing the cultural landscapes of Dry Bay, following along with what's been done in Glacier Bay, which is including producing maps with the Tlingit place names on them. In Dry Bay, you have multiple languages featuring in the place names because it was such an important trade area with the interior. But the names are wonderful and wonderfully descriptive. And I would recommend people go to that. And there's a number of people there who I know were interviewed and that we interviewed separately who had really good knowledge of Dry Bay. So yeah, that's a good resource. And I think some of that is also in the SHI exhibit.
This is Rachel. I'm going to break in to say we're over time. We got started early, got started late, so that's not surprising, but people might have to drop off. We probably have time for another couple of questions. Does anybody have their hand up that I'm not seeing? I'm not seeing any hands. So if you don't know how to raise your hand, I suggest you just unmute yourself and pose the question.
They can't unmute themselves. They have to raise their hand or type in the chat.
Oh, okay.
I can only give permission, if they raise their hand, then I can give them permission to unmute.
Okay.
But if they don't know how to do that, then just type in the chat and you and I can read it out loud.
Okay. Okay. And when we've had a couple more questions, then I'm going to turn it over to Will Schneider, who will close this panel and also give us the welcome that he was going to give us at the beginning, and a few housekeeping things. So let's see if I still don't see any hands or chat. So there will be another session at 2 p.m., which is that is the Richard Nelson, Remembering Richard Nelson session. So first, before we close, let's turn it over to Will.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, a belated welcome, and thank you to Tom and Harvey for getting us started with a wonderful introduction to the natural history and the human history of Sitka. Sitka being the site that we had hoped to visit in person, but you've given us a wonderful opportunity to see Sitka through your eyes. So thank you very much. If you have technical problems like I had, or just ignorance like I have, you can email Karen Brewster or Joan Antonsen, and Karen, I think, will put up on the screen the actual addresses to reach them. I want to recognize Rachel and Joe and Karen for a wonderful job in organizing this conference and getting us into the technology. So special thanks to you. And I also want to recognize Hal Spackman and the Sitka Historical Society, who worked with us over the months when we actually thought we would be able to meet in Sitka. And we're all disappointed not to be there, but we appreciate your support and help. A few housekeeping things. Each session is being recorded, so this will be recorded and will be available publicly. So as I used to say in the oral history business, don't say anything you don't want made public, but tell us everything you can tell us. So do that. Note that your mics are muted when you're not speaking so that there isn't background noise. Use the chat feature to ask questions. And also, the annual business meeting is 2 to 4 on Saturday, and you will be getting, if you haven't gotten it already, a separate sign-in for that. And at that meeting, we'll be giving out the awards, the local historical reports, and we'll be recognizing those of us who have passed on in the past year. So I think it's an important meeting for everyone to attend. One other note, David Reamer's presentation will not be given. And I think that's all I have in the way of housekeeping, but I'm delighted that you're all online and ready to go, and see you at 2 o'clock. Did that work?
Yes, and I wish we had a rousing applause function or even a standing ovation function. But, thank you so much to our keynote speakers, and we'll see everybody at 2 o'clock.
Thanks. Thanks all. Well, cheers.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Hmm.